The morning of January 30th, 1900 in Frankfort, Kentucky was cold and damp. The sky was a flat, slate gray, hanging low over the state capitol. It was the kind of weather that makes people walk faster, heads down, hands buried deep in their pockets. At exactly 11:15 a.m., two men were making their way up the brick walkway toward the old Capitol building. One was a large, imposing figure named Colonel Jack Chin. Walking beside him was a smaller, slighter man in a heavy winter coat. He looked tired. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. This was Senator William Goebel. They were talking quietly, their breath visible in the freezing air. They passed the fountain on the front lawn. They were just yards away from the front steps of the seat of government. And then the air shattered. It was a single, sharp crack. To the veterans of the Civil War who were standing nearby, the sound was unmistakable. It wasn't a firecracker. It was the high-velocity snap of a rifle. But there was no smoke, no flash, just the sound echoing off the limestone walls of the Capitol. William Goebel stopped mid-step. A strange look of surprise crossed his face. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He simply groaned. His body went rigid, and he collapsed onto the wet bricks. For a second, there was absolute silence. The kind of silence that only happens when the human brain is trying to process something impossible. This wasn't a saloon in a lawless mining town. This was the state capital of Kentucky, and a prominent politician had just been gunned down in broad daylight, surrounded by people. Colonel Chin was the first to react. He dropped to his knees, shouting for help. "They have killed him!" he roared at the frozen crowd. "They have killed him!" But who were they? Confusion took over. Men scattered, ducking behind trees and statues, expecting a second shot. Eyes scanned the windows of the government buildings looming over them. Someone pointed a trembling finger at the executive building next door. A few witnesses claimed they saw the barrel of a rifle slowly retreating into the shadows of a third-floor office. That office didn't belong to a random drifter. It belonged to the Secretary of State. Police and friends lifted Goebel's limp body. They didn't take him to a hospital, there wasn't time, and frankly, nowhere was safe. They carried him across the street to the Capitol Hotel. The lobby, usually filled with lobbyists and cigar smoke, turned into a makeshift field hospital. The doors were barred. Armed guards took positions at the windows. Outside, the shock was turning into something much more dangerous: rage. Within minutes, the news hit the telegraph wires. Goebel is shot. The message raced from the capital to the small towns in the east and the river cities in the west. In 1900, this was the equivalent of a nuclear bomb going off in American politics. The United States had lost presidents to assassins before. Lincoln, Garfield. But a governor? A man fighting for the office in real time? That had never happened. As Goebel lay on a hotel mattress, clinging to consciousness, the city of Frankfort began to fill with guns. It felt less like a crime scene and more like the opening minutes of a war. But this bullet didn't just come out of nowhere. It wasn't a random act of madness. That shot was the inevitable conclusion of a conflict that had been boiling for months, years even. It was the final move in a game of chess played with ballots, bribes, and blood. To understand why someone would pull the trigger on a man walking to work, we have to understand the man himself. We have to look into the eyes of the person who made half of Kentucky see him as a savior, and the other half see him as a tyrant who deserved to die. When you think of a Kentucky politician from the 1900s, you probably picture a specific archetype. A friendly, backslapping Southern gentleman with a white suit, a string tie, and a glass of bourbon in his hand. A man who wins votes with charisma and loud speeches. William Goebel was none of those things. He was the son of German immigrants who spoke with a clipped, precise accent. He didn't drink. He didn't smoke. He rarely smiled. While other politicians were out shaking hands at horse races, Goebel was alone in his office, reading law books and studying census data. He was a man of silence in a world of noise. He moved to Covington, Kentucky in Kenton County and quickly realized that power wasn't given, it was taken. He built a political machine so efficient and so ruthless that he earned a nickname that was whispered with a mix of awe and fear: the King of Kenton. Goebel wasn't interested in being popular. He was interested in winning. He treated politics like mathematics. If he could control the election judges, the ballot counters, and the local committees, it didn't matter if you liked him. You couldn't beat him. But don't mistake his cold demeanor for weakness. Beneath that frozen exterior was a man capable of extreme violence. 5 years before he was shot, Goebel had a confrontation with a political rival named John Sanford. They met on the steps of a bank in Covington. It wasn't a debate. It was a shootout. Both men drew revolvers. Imagine the scene. A sunny afternoon, people walking by, and suddenly two politicians are exchanging fire like cowboys. Goebel took a bullet through his coat, but he didn't flinch. He fired one shot. It struck Sanford in the head. The rival died a few hours later. Goebel was charged, but he pleaded self-defense and was acquitted. The message to the rest of the state was crystal clear. William Goebel does not bluff. If you come at him, you better not miss. This incident changed him. He became even more insular, even more determined. He saw himself as a crusader. In his mind, Kentucky was being held hostage by massive corporations, specifically the railroads, who bought and sold laws like groceries. He wanted to break their grip. He positioned himself as the champion of the common man, the enemy of the wealthy elite. But to fight monsters, he became one. He pushed through a law called the Goebel Election Law. It gave the state legislature, which he controlled, the final say in any disputed election. Critics called it a power grab. They said he was trying to make himself dictator of Kentucky. Goebel didn't care what they called it. He knew it was the only way to guarantee his victory. By 1899, he had his eyes on the ultimate prize, the governor's mansion. But he had a problem. He was trying to become the ruler of a state that was fundamentally ungovernable. He was a creature of logic and order, trying to tame a land that was famous for chaos. Because while Goebel was playing 3D chess in the city, the rest of Kentucky was playing a very different game. A game involving blood feuds, mountain justice, and a complete disregard for the written law. To understand how a governor ends up in the crosshairs of a sniper, you have to look at the soil he was standing on. Kentucky has an old nickname, the Dark and Bloody Ground. It's a translation from an indigenous phrase warning early settlers that this land was a hunting ground, not a home. By the turn of the 20th century, the people of Kentucky seemed determined to live up to that name. The United States in 1900 was modernizing. New York had electricity. Chicago had skyscrapers. But Kentucky was suspended in time. It was a place where the frontier spirit never really died. It just curdled into something dangerous. This was the era of the great family feuds. You've heard of the Hatfields and the McCoys. That wasn't a fairy tale. That was a documentary of life in the Appalachian foothills. In these mountains, the legal system was a suggestion, not a rule. If someone wronged you, you didn't call the sheriff. The sheriff was probably related to the guy who wronged you. Instead, you handled it yourself. Justice was personal. It was immediate. And it was usually delivered at around 900 feet per second. But this mentality wasn't limited to the backwoods. It bled into the cities and the halls of power. The Civil War had technically been over for 35 years, but in Kentucky the wounds were still fresh. During the war, the state was split down the middle. Fathers fought for the Union, sons fought for the Confederacy. When the war ended, they all came home, kept their rifles, and tried to live next door to each other. The resentment simmered under the surface of every town square. Politics became the new battlefield. You were either a Democrat or a Republican, and for many men, that distinction was as serious as wearing a blue or gray uniform. Carrying a concealed weapon wasn't just common, it was expected. A local newspaper editor at the time wrote that in Frankfort, a man without a revolver is like a man without his pants. He feels naked and exposed. Arguments in the state legislature frequently ended with men flashing the handles of pistols tucked into their waistbands. This was the atmosphere William Goebel was trying to conquer. He was a man of statutes and written laws, trying to impose order on a society that valued honor above everything else. He looked at this culture of violence and saw it as backward. He wanted to drag Kentucky into the 20th century, kicking and screaming if necessary. But he made a critical miscalculation. He thought he could use the law to control these men. He didn't realize that to them, the law was just paper, and paper doesn't stop a bullet. But the feuds and the old soldiers were just the soldiers on the ground. The generals, the real power behind the violence, were much more sophisticated. They didn't wear homespun clothes or ride mules. They wore silk suits, sat in boardrooms, and controlled the most powerful machine on earth. In 1900, there was one power in America greater than the president, greater than Congress, and certainly greater than any state governor: the railroads. And in Kentucky, the undisputed king was the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, the L&N. Imagine a company today that owns the internet, the roads you drive on, and the bank where you keep your money. That was the L&N. They didn't just move coal and tobacco, they moved politicians. Their lobbyists didn't knock on doors, they kicked them down. They had an unlimited budget to ensure that no law was ever passed that might hurt their profits. If a judge ruled against them, that judge would find himself voted out in the next election. If a newspaper wrote bad things about them, that newspaper would suddenly lose all its advertising revenue. They were the invisible hand that guided the state. William Goebel looked at the L&N and saw a dragon that needed to be slain. His entire political platform was built on regulating the railroads. He wanted to increase their taxes. He wanted to force them to improve safety for workers. He wanted to cap their rates so farmers wouldn't be gouged to ship their crops. To the common people, this sounded like justice. To the railroad tycoons, it sounded like a declaration of war. The CEO of the L&N, Milton Smith, was a man who allegedly said, "Society, as created, was for the purpose of one man's getting what the other fellow has, if he can." He wasn't about to let a stiff, unsmiling lawyer from Covington take away his gold. The railroad poured money into the opposition. They funded Goebel's rivals. They printed pamphlets painting Goebel as a socialist, a tyrant, a destroyer of jobs. But Goebel was relentless. Every time they attacked him, he hit back harder. He used his influence in the legislature to block their bills. He publicly named the lobbyists who were bribing senators. It became a personal vendetta. The L&N realized that Goebel couldn't be bought. He couldn't be bullied, and he was too smart to be tricked. So, the strategy changed. If they couldn't beat him with money, they would have to beat him with politics. They needed to make sure he never got the nomination for governor. They needed to crush him at his own party's convention. The stage was set for the Democratic Convention in Louisville. It was supposed to be a routine political gathering. Instead, it turned into something that looked more like a riot in a prison yard. The railroad men were there. Goebel was there. And everyone brought their friends. And by friends, I mean men with badges, clubs, and very short tempers. The music hall in Louisville was packed to the rafters. It was hot, it was loud, and it smelled of sweat and stale tobacco. This was the Democratic Nominating Convention of 1899. Usually, a party convention is a celebration. This was a brawl. There were 3 men fighting for the nomination. One was a former Confederate general. One was a wealthy grandstander. And then there was William Goebel. On paper, Goebel was in 3rd place. He didn't have the delegates. The other 2 candidates had combined their forces to lock him out. The railroad lobbyists were in the back of the room, smiling, confident that the Goebel problem was about to be solved. But they forgot who they were dealing with. Goebel wasn't a man who played by the rules. He was a man who rewrote them. He controlled the chaotic committee that organized the convention. He used parliamentary procedures like a weapon. He made alliances that shocked everyone, agreeing to support one rival's policies if that rival dropped out. He twisted arms. He made promises in back rooms that no one heard but everyone understood. For days, the convention was deadlocked. The tension inside the hall was suffocating. Fistfights broke out on the floor. Delegates shouted each other down. The police, who were loyal to Goebel's machine in Louisville, stood by, letting Goebel's supporters intimidate the opposition while cracking down on anyone who spoke against him. It was a masterclass in political brute force. Slowly, methodically, Goebel chipped away at the opposition. He turned enemies into friends and friends into fanatics. When the final vote came, the hall went silent. The numbers were read out. William Goebel was the nominee. The room exploded, half in cheers, half in boos. The railroad men stopped smiling. They had thrown everything they had at him: money, influence, threats, and he had simply walked through it all. But this victory came at a terrible cost. The Democratic Party was now shattered. The supporters of the other candidates were furious. They felt cheated. They felt like the nomination had been stolen, not won. A large faction of Democrats, calling themselves the Honest Election League, broke away. They refused to support Goebel. They said they would rather vote for a Republican than for the dictator from Kenton. This was exactly what the Republicans had been waiting for. For the first time in decades, they had a real chance to take the governorship. They nominated a man named William Taylor, a lawyer from the mountains, a man with deep connections to the feudists and the fighters of eastern Kentucky. The battle lines were drawn. Goebel had the machine, Taylor had the mountains, and the election that followed would make the convention look like a tea party. If the Democratic Convention was a brawl, the general election of 1899 was an all-out war. It was William Goebel versus the Republican William Taylor, but it felt more like a grudge match between two different Kentuckys. On one side, you had Goebel's political machine based in the cities. They were masters of the modern tools of politics: voter registration, party discipline, and control of the press. On the other side, you had Taylor's base in the mountains. They didn't have machines, they had families. They didn't have party discipline, they had blood loyalty. And they didn't trust anything that came out of a printing press. The campaign was a hurricane of insults and accusations. Taylor's supporters called Goebel a German dictator, an atheist, and an enemy of the people. Goebel's supporters painted Taylor as an uneducated hick, a pawn of the railroads, and a friend to outlaws. But this wasn't just a war of words. It was a war of fraud. In the mountains, Republican sheriffs openly intimidated Democratic voters, suggesting it might be unhealthy for them to show up on election day. Men with rifles would stand near polling places, not saying a word, just cleaning their guns. In the cities, Goebel's machine used more subtle but equally effective tactics. They hired men to vote multiple times under different names. They paid people to stay home. And they perfected a technique that became legendary in the history of dirty politics: the tissue paper ballot. It was simple. The official ballots were printed on standard paper. But Goebel's men would print thousands of identical ballots on paper so thin it was almost transparent. You could fold 5, 10, even 20 of these ballots together, and they would feel like a single sheet of paper. These bundles were then handed to a trusted voter who would slip them into the ballot box. One man could cast dozens of votes. It was so blatant, so out in the open, that it became a joke. A dark, cynical joke that everyone knew was true. When election day finally came, the state held its breath. The results trickled in by telegraph. Taylor was winning big in the mountains. Goebel was running up huge, almost unbelievable margins in the cities. The final count was razor thin. Out of more than 400,000 votes cast, the official winner was the Republican William Taylor. He had won by just over 2,300 votes. The Republicans celebrated. The L&N Railroad breathed a sigh of relief. The newspapers declared Taylor the next governor of Kentucky. There was just one problem. William Goebel did not lose elections, and he had written a law specifically for this exact situation. The election was over. The votes were counted. William Taylor was the governor-elect. In any other state, in any other year, that would have been the end of the story. But this was Kentucky, and William Goebel had an ace up his sleeve. Months earlier, he had forced the legislature to pass the infamous Goebel election law. The law created a board of election commissioners appointed by the democratic-controlled legislature. And this board, Goebel's board, had the final absolute authority to decide the validity of any election. They could accept the results, or they could throw them out. You can probably see where this is going. As soon as the results came in, Goebel and his legal team formally contested the election. They didn't even bother arguing about the tissue paper ballots in Louisville. Instead, they pointed their fingers at the mountain counties. They claimed that Republican sheriffs had used threats and intimidation to prevent Democrats from voting. They produced affidavits, some legitimate, some highly suspicious, from people who said they were too scared to go to the polls. They argued that in certain counties, the votes were so tainted by fraud that they should be thrown out entirely. It was a brilliant legal maneuver. He didn't have to prove he got more votes. He just had to disqualify enough of his opponent's votes to put himself on top. The Board of Election Commissioners began their hearings. It was a complete sham. The three-man board was made up of two staunch Goebel Democrats and only one Republican. The outcome was preordained. Every day, the board would listen to evidence, and every day, they would rule in Goebel's favor. They threw out a block of votes here. They invalidated a precinct there. With each decision, Taylor's 2,300 vote lead shrank, first to 1,500, then to 800, then to less than 100. The Republicans were screaming. They called it a coup. They called it theft in broad daylight. The Republican Attorney General, William Taylor himself, tried to get the courts to intervene, but the law was written in a way that made the board's decision legally unchallengeable. As the board got closer to officially declaring Goebel the winner, the mood in Kentucky shifted from anger to something much more primal. The men in the mountains, who had fought and bled for the Union and the Republican Party, heard the news from the Capitol. They heard that their votes, their voices, were being erased by a handful of politicians in a smoke-filled room. They were not the kind of men to take that sitting down. They decided if the law wouldn't protect their victory, they would protect it themselves. And they started cleaning their rifles. As the election board slowly dismantled Taylor's victory, William Goebel became the most hated man in Kentucky. And the hatred wasn't just political anymore. It was personal. The death threats started as a trickle, then became a flood. Anonymous letters arrived at his office every day. Some were crude, scrawled on scrap paper. "Get out of Frankfort, or you'll be carried out in a box." Others were more eloquent, written in neat cursive, detailing exactly how and when he would meet his end. Newspapers loyal to the Republicans ran thinly veiled warnings. They published cartoons of Goebel wearing a crown, standing on a pile of skulls. They wrote editorials that didn't just criticize his politics, they questioned his right to exist. One paper wrote, "When the law fails, men will find other ways to seek justice." Everyone knew what other ways meant. Goebel's friends grew increasingly worried. They begged him to be more careful. They told him not to walk the same route to the Capitol every day. They suggested he hire a bodyguard, or at least carry a pistol more openly. He dismissed them all. You have to understand, Goebel had lived with threats his entire life. He had already survived one shootout. He had faced down angry mobs at the convention. In his mind, these letters were just noise from an enemy he had already beaten. He saw it as a sign of their desperation, not their strength. He had an almost arrogant belief in his own invincibility. He was a creature of the law, of systems, of order. He genuinely believed that in the end, the system would protect him. That his enemies were loud, but ultimately they were cowards who wouldn't dare to act. But then the threats got more specific. A letter arrived that was different from the others. It wasn't angry, it was cold. It detailed his daily routine with chilling accuracy. What time he left the hotel, the path he took, who he walked with. It ended with a simple sentence. "There are 100 men in this town who have sworn an oath to kill you. One of them will not miss." This was no longer just political posturing. This was a tactical plan. Even then, Goebel refused to change his routine. To do so would be a sign of weakness. it would be admitting that he was afraid. And William Goebel was not afraid of anything. But as the days ticked by in January of 1900, the nature of the threat began to change. It was no longer about a lone assassin hiding in an alley. It was about something much bigger, much more organized, and much more terrifying. The whispers of 100 men were about to become the roar of 1,000. On January 25, 1900, a train pulled into the station at Frankfort, then another and another. But these weren't passenger trains carrying businessmen and families. The doors slid open and out poured an army. Over 1,000 men, most of them from the mountain counties of eastern Kentucky, stepped onto the platform. They were tall and lean, with hard eyes and weathered faces. They didn't carry signs or banners. They carried rifles. Winchester repeaters, old Civil War muskets, shotguns and pistols tucked into their belts. They called themselves auditors. They said they were just there to peacefully petition the legislature to certify Taylor as governor. But nobody was fooled. This wasn't a petition. This was an occupation. Imagine the scene. The quiet, sleepy capital city, with its handful of local police, was suddenly flooded with 1,000 armed men who answered to no one. They set up camp on the State House lawn. They walked the streets in disciplined groups, their rifles resting on their shoulders. They were polite, but their message was as sharp as a bayonet. Steal this election and we burn this city to the ground. This wasn't a spontaneous uprising. It was organized. It was funded by the railroad companies and tacitly approved by the Republican leadership, including Governor-elect Taylor himself. They had arranged the trains. They had provided the food. They had turned a political dispute into a military standoff. The Democrats in the legislature were terrified. They had to walk past these armed men every day just to get to work. The auditors would stand in silent, menacing lines, staring them down. It was psychological warfare at its most effective. Frankfort became a powder keg. On one side of the street were the state legislators, protected by a small contingent of the state militia loyal to the current Democratic governor. On the other side was the unofficial mountain army, loyal only to William Taylor. The air was thick with the possibility of a bloodbath. A single stray shot, a single drunken argument, could have ignited a battle in the streets of the capital. It was the closest an American state had come to its own civil war since 1865. William Goebel saw the army on the lawn, and still he was unmoved. He saw them as bluffing, as a desperate last-ditch scare tactic. He ordered his Democratic allies in the legislature to hold firm. Do not be intimidated. Continue the process. Certify him as governor. He was scheduled to walk to the Capitol on the morning of January 30th to oversee the final proceedings. His friends pleaded with him one last time. "Don't go," they said. "They are going to kill you." He just looked at them with his cold, determined eyes and said, "I will not be a coward." It was the last conversation he would have with many of them. The stage was set. The actors were in place, and the final act was about to begin. The morning of January 30th was exactly like the morning before. It was grey, it was cold, and the air was still. The mountain army was still camped on the lawn, but they were quiet, huddled around small fires, watching. Inside the Capitol Hotel, William Goebel prepared for the day. He put on his suit and his heavy winter overcoat. He knew this was the day. The election board was expected to make its final ruling. By nightfall, he believed he would be the rightful governor of Kentucky. He wasn't alone. Two friends flanked him for the short walk to the Capitol building. One was a fellow state senator. The other was Colonel Jack Chin, a former lawman and a man known for his toughness. He was acting as Goebel's unofficial bodyguard. A third man, a bodyguard named Ephraim Lillard, was also supposed to be there. But for reasons lost to history, he was running a few minutes late. It was a delay that would haunt him for the rest of his life. At around 11:15 a.m., Goebel and his two companions stepped out of the hotel. The journey was short, just a couple hundred yards. They walked down the street, turned, and started up the main walkway leading to the old state capitol. The geography of this location is critical. To their right was the Capitol building itself, a beautiful Greek revival structure with limestone columns. To their left, across the lawn, was the Executive Building, a newer, taller office building that housed the state's most powerful officials. The walkway they were on cut right between the two, an open space with very little cover. As they walked, they could see the armed mountaineers watching them from a distance. The men weren't moving. They weren't shouting. They were just watching. It must have felt like walking through a silent, hostile crowd. Colonel Chin was nervous. He kept scanning the windows of the buildings around them. He later said he had a premonition of evil. He urged Goebel to walk faster. Goebel, ever defiant, refused. He walked at his usual, deliberate pace. He was not going to run. He was not going to show fear. He was making a statement. This is my state. This is my capital. You do not scare me. They passed the large iron fountain that stood in the center of the lawn. They were now less than 50 feet from the front steps of the Capitol. Victory was literally within sight. Across the lawn, in the Executive Building, someone was watching their approach through the sights of a rifle, waiting for the precise moment when Goebel would be perfectly framed, perfectly exposed, with nowhere to run. The final seconds were ticking away. The shot was not a boom. It was a crack, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the damp morning air. For a fraction of a second, no one moved. It was a sound so out of place, so alien to the quiet routine of government, that the brain simply refused to process it. William Goebel stopped walking. He didn't cry out. He didn't fall immediately. He swayed on his feet, a look of profound surprise on his face. He turned to Colonel Chin, his voice a hoarse whisper. "They got me," he said. And then his legs gave out, and he crumpled onto the cold ground. Chaos erupted. Colonel Chin dropped to his knees beside Goebel, his instincts as a lawman taking over. He pulled open Goebel's overcoat, looking for the source of the injury. At the same time, his eyes were scanning, searching for the shooter. But there was nothing to see. This is a crucial detail. In 1900, firearms still used black powder. A rifle shot would have produced a thick cloud of white or grey smoke, instantly revealing the shooter's position. But the shot that hit Goebel was different. It was fired with new, state-of-the-art smokeless powder. It was a modern assassination carried out with a modern weapon. The killer was invisible. Men on the lawn who had been standing still were now running in every direction. Some ran for cover, diving behind the iron fountain. Others ran towards Goebel, wanting to help. A few, including Chin, drew their own pistols and started firing wildly into the air or at the windows of the Executive Building, hoping to suppress an enemy they couldn't even see. The scene was pure pandemonium, shouts and screams mixed with the sporadic pop of pistol fire. Witnesses later tried to piece together the moment. Several people agreed on one thing: the shot had come from the left, from the direction of the Executive Building. More specifically, it seemed to come from a window on the first floor, a window that belonged to the office of the Republican Secretary of State, Caleb Powers. A small group of brave men, police officers and citizens, immediately rushed the entrance to the Executive Building. They found the front door unlocked. But when they sprinted up the stairs to Caleb Powers' office, they slammed into a locked door. They could hear shuffling from inside. They banged on the door, demanding entry. For a few precious seconds, there was no answer. Then, the door was opened by a clerk who looked pale and shaken. The room was empty. There was no rifle, no shooter, just an open window and the cold January air pouring in. The assassin had vanished. As doctors in the Capitol Hotel worked frantically to save William Goebel's life, investigators outside began to reconstruct his death. The lawn of the state capitol was no longer a political space. It was a crime scene. And the central mystery was simple and yet impossibly complex. Where did the shot come from? The first and most obvious answer was the Executive Building. The office of Secretary of State Caleb Powers provided a perfect elevated line of sight to the walkway. It was less than 200 feet away, a simple shot for a trained marksman. Several witnesses swore they heard the report come from that direction. The locked door, the nervous clerk, it all pointed to a conspiracy within the Republican administration. But the more investigators talked to people, the murkier the story became. Other witnesses, standing in different locations, told a different story. They claimed the sound came from behind Goebel, from the State Library building on the other side of the walkway. The angle was different, more difficult, but not impossible. Suddenly, the police didn't have one sniper's nest. They had two. This created a huge problem. If the shot came from the Secretary of State's office, it was a clear political assassination ordered by Goebel's enemies. But if it came from the library, who was over there? It opened up the possibility of a lone wolf or a different conspiracy entirely. It was the 1900 version of the grassy knoll. Then there was the bullet itself. Doctors were eventually able to extract the projectile that struck Goebel. It was a .38 caliber slug, but it wasn't made of soft lead that would flatten on impact. It was a steel-jacketed bullet. This was a projectile designed to be aerodynamic, to travel faster and hit harder. It was a bullet meant for killing, not for hunting. The evidence was clear. This was not a random act of violence. This was a professional hit. The choice of smokeless powder to hide the location, the use of a high-velocity, steel-jacketed bullet for maximum damage, and the precise timing of the shot, it all pointed to a shooter who was patient, skilled, and utterly ruthless. Investigators now had a profile of their killer, an expert marksman with access to a modern rifle. But they had no weapon, no suspect, and two conflicting locations. They had a ghost. But in the chaotic hours after the shooting, the search for the truth took a back seat to the struggle for power. The Republican governor-elect, William Taylor, wasn't waiting for the police to solve the case. He saw the city filling with his armed supporters and Goebel's enraged followers. He saw the state slipping into anarchy, and he decided to make a move that would shock the nation and push Kentucky to the absolute brink of open war. While doctors fought to keep a bullet from ending William Goebel's life, William Taylor fought to keep a political process from ending his career, and he used the oldest tool in the tyrant's handbook, fear. Seeing the city swarming with armed men, both his supporters and Goebel's, Taylor made a declaration. He announced that the city of Frankfort was in a state of insurrection. He claimed there was an active rebellion against the lawful government of Kentucky. And then, he called out the militia. The sound of a bugle echoed through the streets. The unofficial mountain army was told to stand down. They were replaced by the uniformed official Kentucky State Guard. But these soldiers weren't there to keep the peace. They were there to enforce Taylor's will. Their first order was to march on the state capitol. They surrounded the building, forming a perimeter with fixed bayonets. They set up barricades on the streets. They took control of the city. Frankfort was under martial law. The next morning, when the members of the state legislature, the very men who were about to declare Goebel governor, tried to go to work, they were met by a line of soldiers. They were told the legislature was suspended indefinitely by order of the governor. They were blocked, at gunpoint, from entering their own chambers. It was a breathtaking move. Taylor had used the assassination attempt as the perfect excuse to do what he couldn't do legally: stop the vote. He had effectively shut down the democratic process with the barrel of a gun. The entire nation was stunned. This wasn't happening in some banana republic. This was happening in the United States of America. A sitting governor was using the military to prevent the legislature from convening. Taylor defended his actions. He said he was preventing further bloodshed, that he was restoring order. But everyone knew what was really happening. He had locked his opponents out of the building. As long as the legislature couldn't meet, they couldn't vote. And as long as they couldn't vote, he remained in power. It was a checkmate. Or so he thought. The Democratic legislators were now outcasts in their own capital. They were locked out, hunted, and powerless. They couldn't fight the militia in the streets. But William Goebel had taught them one thing. If the front door is locked, you find a back door. Forced out of the halls of power, they scattered into the city. And in secret, in hushed tones, they began to hatch a plan so audacious, it sounded like something out of a spy novel. They were going to form a government in exile, right under the noses of the soldiers who patrolled the streets. With the Capitol building occupied by soldiers, the Democratic legislators were fugitives in their own city. They couldn't meet in public. They couldn't communicate openly. Every move was watched, so they went underground. Their new seat of government wasn't a grand hall with marble columns. It was a series of cramped, smoke-filled rooms in the Capitol Hotel, the same hotel where William Goebel was lying, fighting for every breath, just a few floors above. The plan was simple, but dangerous. They had to officially convene the legislature. To do that, they needed a quorum, a legal majority of members present. If they could get a quorum, they could hold a vote. And if they could hold a vote, they could throw out the election results and declare Goebel the governor. The problem was getting everyone there without being arrested. The Democrats sent out runners in the dead of night. They slipped messages under hotel room doors. They used secret knocks and passwords. One by one, legislators disguised themselves as traveling salesmen or doctors and made their way to the hotel. They snuck in through back alleys and kitchen entrances, avoiding the militia patrols that crisscrossed the city. Inside the hotel lobby, which was now an armed camp of Goebel supporters, they did a frantic headcount. They were close, but not there yet. They needed more state senators, more representatives. In a legendary move, they sent a team to the train station to literally pull Democratic legislators off of outbound trains, telling them, "You're not leaving. The government is meeting in the hotel." Finally, late in the afternoon on January 31st, they had it, a legal quorum. They crowded into the hotel's main dining room, locking the doors behind them. With armed guards of their own posted outside, they called the Kentucky General Assembly to order. The proceedings were a surreal spectacle. There were no reporters. There were no spectators. Just a group of determined, exhausted men conducting the business of the state in whispers, while a dying man lay upstairs and an army occupied the city outside. They moved fast. A motion was made to accept the findings of the Election Commission, the findings that invalidated thousands of Republican votes, the findings that made William Goebel the winner. The Speaker of the House called for a vote. A chorus of ayes echoed through the room. It was done. In the eyes of the law, or at least their interpretation of it, William Goebel was now the official governor of Kentucky. There was just one final, solemn step. They had to swear him in, and they had to do it before he died. The vote was over. The paperwork was signed. A small delegation of lawmakers, along with the Chief Justice of the Kentucky Supreme Court, left the makeshift assembly in the dining room and made their way up the stairs. They walked quietly down the hotel corridor, past the armed guards, to the room where William Goebel lay. The scene inside was grim. The room was dimly lit, smelling of antiseptic and blood. Doctors stood by helplessly. Goebel was stretched out on a mattress, pale and barely conscious. The steel-jacketed bullet had torn through his body, and the surgeons knew there was nothing more they could do. He was fading. The Chief Justice approached the bed. He leaned in close so Goebel could hear him. He explained what had just happened downstairs, that the legislature had met, that they had voted, that he was now, officially, the governor. According to those in the room, a flicker of recognition appeared in Goebel's eyes. This was the moment he had fought for, the prize he had schemed for, the office he had nearly died for. The Chief Justice held up a Bible and began to administer the oath of office. He recited the words, his voice low and steady in the quiet room. "I do solemnly swear that I will support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of this Commonwealth, and be faithful and true to the Commonwealth of Kentucky so long as I continue a citizen thereof, and that I will faithfully execute, to the best of my ability, the office of governor according to law." When he finished, he looked at Goebel. The dying man's lips moved, but no sound came out. He was too weak to speak. One of his allies, J.C.S. Blackburn, leaned over him. "Governor," he said, "if you are unable to repeat the oath, hold up your right hand." Slowly, with what must have been his last reserve of strength, William Goebel lifted his hand a few inches off the mattress. It was enough. The oath was complete. William Goebel, a man with a fatal wound, a man who would never sit in the governor's chair, was now the legal head of the state of Kentucky. It was a moment unprecedented in American history. A governor sworn in on his deathbed. A government formed in a hotel room while the official capital was under military occupation. The news spread through the city like a shockwave. To Goebel's supporters, it was a triumph of justice. To Taylor's supporters, it was the ultimate act of treason. And to everyone, it meant one terrifying thing. Kentucky no longer had a governor-elect and a contestant. It now had two men who both claimed to be the one true governor. And both of them had an army. With Goebel's deathbed oath, the crisis in Kentucky entered its most dangerous phase. The state now had two heads. In the governor's mansion, William Taylor sat surrounded by the state militia. He issued executive orders. He declared the Democrats' hotel room meeting illegal. He was, by all appearances, in charge of the machinery of government. He had the buildings, the soldiers, and the official seal. Less than 1,000 feet away, in the Capitol Hotel, the newly sworn-in Governor William Goebel lay dying. His government, led by his Lieutenant Governor J.C.W. Beckham, issued its own set of orders. They commanded the militia to disband. They declared Taylor a usurper. They had the legal document, the vote, and the title. It was a stalemate made of steel and paper. The city of Frankfort became a ghost town under armed guard. Businesses were shuttered. The streets were empty, except for the patrols. On one corner, you would see Taylor's uniformed militia, bayonets fixed. On the next, you'd see a group of Goebel's civilian supporters, rifles in hand, guarding the hotel. They stared each other down across the empty streets, fingers resting on triggers. The tension was unbearable. A single backfire from a car, a single misunderstood shout, could have been the spark that ignited a street battle. The news was a national scandal. President William McKinley in Washington, D.C. watched with growing alarm. He was being urged to send in the U.S. Army to disarm both sides and take control of the state. The federal government was preparing for the possibility that a star on the American flag was about to collapse into chaos. For 3 days, this bizarre and terrifying standoff continued. Taylor controlled the capital, but his orders were ignored by most of the state. The Goebel government had the legal claim, but their leader was too weak to even sign his name. Both sides were waiting for the other to blink. They were waiting for a court to rule, for federal troops to arrive, for something to break the deadlock. But the thing that was going to break wasn't a political alliance or a military line. It was the frail, fading life of the man at the center of it all. As the politicians argued and the soldiers stood their watch, the doctors in Goebel's room knew the stalemate had a deadline, and that deadline was fast approaching. On the afternoon of February 3rd, 1900, the doctors in the Capitol Hotel knew the end was near. Governor William Goebel, who had clung to life for 4 agonizing days, was slipping away. His room was filled with his closest allies, the men who had orchestrated the hotel room government. They gathered around his bed, watching in silence. Goebel had been unconscious for hours, but in a final brief moment of clarity, his eyes opened. He couldn't see them clearly. His voice was a faint whisper, barely audible over the sound of his own labored breathing. According to the legend, which was printed in newspapers across the country, he spoke a few final words to his friend, J.C.S. Blackburn. He supposedly said, "Tell my friends to be brave, fearless, and loyal to the common people." Whether he actually uttered these exact words is debated by historians. But it doesn't really matter. The sentiment was true to the man. It was his last political testament. a final command from a dying general to his loyal soldiers. A few moments later, at 6:40 p.m., Governor William Goebel died. He was 44 years old. The news of his death moved through the tense city, not with a bang, but with a quiet, heavy sadness. The rage that had followed the shooting now gave way to a wave of grief and shock. The impossible had happened. The state's chief executive had been assassinated. His death instantly changed the political calculus. He was no longer a divisive politician. He was a martyr. The standoff, which had seemed so intractable, suddenly began to crumble. Public opinion, which had been divided, now swung massively in favor of the Democrats. Goebel's death was seen as the ultimate proof that the Republicans had gone too far, that their tactics of intimidation had crossed a line into murder. William Taylor, sitting in the governor's mansion, must have felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. He was no longer just a political rival. He was now the man in charge when the new governor was killed. The assassination had happened on his watch by men who supported him from an office belonging to his Secretary of State. The legal and moral weight of Goebel's death was now an anchor, dragging Taylor's administration down into the depths. The armed standoff was over. The political war was lost, and a new war was just beginning. The war for justice. The manhunt for the killer and for the powerful men who had given the order was about to begin. And the first person they were going to look for was the man who had just lost everything, Governor William Taylor. With Goebel dead, the Democratic Lieutenant Governor J.C.W. Beckham was immediately sworn in as the new governor. The dual government crisis was over. There was only one governor now, and he was a Democrat. Beckham's first act was to demand that William Taylor and the Republican administration be held accountable for the assassination. The political battle was over. The legal battle had begun. William Taylor found himself in an impossible position. He was still in the governor's mansion, but he had no power. The state militia, seeing the tide turn, began to abandon him. His political allies were either silent or actively distancing themselves. He was isolated, a king trapped in an empty castle. Then came the news that sealed his fate. A grand jury in Frankfort, now firmly under the control of the new Democratic administration, began issuing indictments. They didn't just indict a few low-level mountain men, they went straight to the top. They indicted Caleb Powers, the Secretary of State, in whose office the sniper was believed to have hidden. They indicted his brother, and then they issued an indictment for William S. Taylor, charging him as an accessory to the murder of William Goebel. This was a moment without precedent. A man who, just days earlier, was the acting governor of a U.S. state was now a wanted fugitive for the murder of his successor. Taylor knew he would never get a fair trial in the hyper-partisan atmosphere of Frankfort. To him, the courts were now just another weapon in the hands of his enemies. He believed that if he was arrested, he would be convicted, whether he was guilty or not. His life was in danger, so he decided to run. Under the cover of darkness, William Taylor snuck out of the governor's mansion. He made his way to Louisville, where he hid for a few days. Then, with the help of allies, he boarded a train. He didn't travel in a private car. He traveled in secret, like a common outlaw. He crossed the Ohio River into Indiana. The moment he stepped onto Indiana soil, he was beyond the reach of Kentucky law enforcement. The Republican governor of Indiana was a political ally and refused to extradite him. William Taylor, the man who had won the election, was now a governor in exile. He would spend the rest of his life in Indianapolis, working as an insurance lawyer, forever looking over his shoulder. He was eventually pardoned years later, but he never set foot in Kentucky again. He had escaped, but he left behind a trail of accomplices, and the new Democratic government was determined to make them pay for the crime of the century. With Taylor gone, the prosecutors in Frankfort turned their full attention to the men he left behind. The investigation became a sprawling, politically charged manhunt. The central question was no longer just who pulled the trigger, but how high did the conspiracy go? The first and most obvious target was Caleb Powers, the Republican Secretary of State. It was his office. He was the one who had helped organize the Mountain Army's arrival in Frankfort. To the Democrats, he was the clear mastermind. Powers was arrested and charged with being the architect of the entire plot. But Powers insisted he was innocent. He claimed that on the morning of the shooting, he had allowed several men from the mountains to use his office. He said he had no idea what they were planning. Was he a conspirator or just a foolish man who left his door unlocked at the worst possible time? Then the investigators got a break. They arrested a man named Henry Utsi. Utsi was a clerk in the state auditor's office, and he was known to have a reputation as a political fixer. Under intense interrogation, Utsi cracked. He confessed. He told the police that he was the middleman. He said that the plan to assassinate Goebel was hatched in the days leading up to January 30th. He named the other men involved. He claimed Caleb Powers was the ringleader. And most importantly, he named the triggerman. According to Utsi, the man who fired the fatal shot was James Jim Howard, a skilled marksman from Clay County. Howard was known for his deadly accuracy with a rifle and his involvement in a violent family feud. He had come to Frankfort with the Mountain Army seeking a pardon from Governor Taylor for a previous killing. Utsi claimed that Howard was promised this pardon in exchange for eliminating Goebel. With Utsi's confession, the police had their narrative. Caleb Powers was the brain, Henry Utsi was the organizer, and Jim Howard was the assassin. Howard was arrested. He, like Powers, proclaimed his innocence. But the prosecution now had a star witness. It seemed like the case was open and shut. But a deep, nagging question remained. Were these men the true masterminds? Or were they just the most convenient scapegoats? Caleb Powers was a high-ranking official, yes, but was he powerful enough to order a political assassination on his own? Or were his orders coming from someone even higher? Someone in a corporate boardroom, perhaps? The L&N Railroad had the most to gain from Goebel's death. They had the money, the power, and the motive to fund such a plot. But their names never appeared on any indictment. They were ghosts in the machine, their influence felt but never seen. The stage was set for a series of trials that would captivate the state for years. Trials that promised justice, but would deliver only more confusion, more politics, and more doubt. The trials for the murder of William Goebel were not legal proceedings. They were a continuation of the political war by other means. The trials were held in Georgetown, a town dominated by Goebel's Democratic supporters. The jury pool was tainted from the start. Finding 12 impartial men in Kentucky to judge this case was like trying to find 12 dry spots in the middle of an ocean. Caleb Powers, the alleged mastermind, was the first to face the court. The prosecution, relying heavily on the testimony of the confessed accomplice Henry Utsi, painted Powers as a cold-blooded plotter who sacrificed others for his own political ambition. Powers' defense argued that Utsi was a liar, a desperate man trying to save his own skin by implicating a bigger name. The jury found Caleb Powers guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison. Next came the alleged triggerman, Jim Howard. Once again, Utsi was the star witness. Howard's lawyers argued that he was a pawn, a simple man from the mountains who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. They pointed out that no physical evidence, no rifle, no fingerprints ever linked him to the crime scene. The jury found Jim Howard guilty. He was sentenced to death. It seemed like justice had been served. But the story was far from over. Both cases were immediately appealed. The Kentucky Court of Appeals, the state's highest court, reviewed the trials, and in a stunning reversal, they threw out both convictions. The court ruled that the trials had been fundamentally unfair. The judge had shown bias, the jury was prejudiced, and the evidence was questionable. They ordered new trials. So they did it all again. A second time, Caleb Powers was found guilty. A second time, Jim Howard was found guilty. And a second time, the convictions were overturned on appeal. They went for a third trial. This time, the trial for Caleb Powers ended in a hung jury. They couldn't reach a verdict. He had been in jail for 8 years, tried 3 times for the same crime, and the state still couldn't make a conviction stick. The legal system was exhausted. The political fire that had fueled the prosecutions was starting to burn out. Public sentiment began to shift. Many people started to feel that the endless trials were more about democratic revenge than about finding the truth. In 1908, a Republican was finally elected governor of Kentucky. One of his very first acts was to issue a full pardon for Caleb Powers and all the other men who had been convicted in the Goebel case, including Jim Howard. After 8 years, multiple trials, and millions of dollars, not a single person served a full sentence for the assassination of Governor William Goebel. The case was officially closed. But for history, the biggest question remained unanswered. If these men weren't the real killers, or if their guilt couldn't be proven, then who really killed the governor? So, who killed William Goebel? The official answer, based on a confession and a series of tainted trials, points to a small group of Republican operatives. But the truth is, we will likely never know for sure. The assassin, like the smokeless powder he used, left no trace. He was a ghost, an instrument of a political machine that was powerful enough to take a life and then erase the evidence of its own existence. But in a way, the identity of the man who pulled the trigger is the least important part of this story. Because the bullet that struck William Goebel did more than just end his life. It fired a fatal shot into the heart of an entire way of life. The assassination shocked Kentucky to its core. The open carrying of weapons in the capital, the use of private armies to intimidate legislators, the blatant election fraud, these things had been accepted, or at least tolerated, as just the way things were. After Goebel's death, they were no longer acceptable. The public was horrified. They had peered over the edge of the cliff into civil war, and they pulled back, terrified of what they saw. In the years that followed, a wave of reforms swept through the state. New laws were passed to ensure fair elections. The culture of feuding and political violence, which had defined Kentucky for a century, began to slowly fade away. The state, which had been trapped in the 19th century, was finally, violently, pushed into the 20th. William Goebel was a cold and ruthless man. He was a political machine builder who was willing to bend any rule to win. He was not a saint, but he was also a man who saw a system corrupted by corporate money and cronyism, and he dedicated his life to breaking it. In a strange and tragic irony, his death accomplished what his life's work never could. As a living politician, he was a divisive figure who tore his party and his state apart. But as a martyr, he became a unifying symbol. He was the man whose death was so shocking, it forced everyone to agree that things had to change. They stole an election from him, and when that didn't work, they stole his life. But that final act of violence backfired. The bullet that was meant to preserve the old feudal system of power ended up being the very thing that killed it. William Goebel lost the battle for his life, but in doing so, he won his war.